Hello and welcome to workbook lesson number 4. So today the lesson is these thoughts do not mean anything. The best way to maybe approach this is to do a little recap. So first we started with nothing I see means anything. So then it came I have given everything I see all the meaning that it has for me. And then it became I do not understand anything that I see. This one is the next step, obviously. So we're talking about the images that we see as being an effect. All those things that you see, we always thought of as something distinct from you, something separated from you. But what the course is outlining is something what we were talking about earlier, that sort of mind-matter distinction. So mind being the stimulus, the creator of the matter that we see in the world. And it's not quite as simple as maybe just saying that outright, but again, we can maybe best understand this through our picture. So if we look at this again, and I know I've really been beating this horse a lot, but if we look at this again, this is probably the best way to understand it. So these thoughts do not mean anything. So what are these thoughts? We've already talked about what we see on the screen as not being what we think it is, us giving all the meaning that it has to us, and that we don't understand what we see. We're going back to the source though now. So mind, which is involved with each of these people, and more importantly, this one. So these are not dissimilar, these two sorts of minds. So we have all these ones that are creating. I think the best way to kind of explain this is to explain it through emission theory. So emission is the idea that mind is creating the world. It's sort of like what we see as an effect of what we believe, kind of thing. And that goes true for both of these. So emission of this would lead to a undifferentiating world, and then each of these individual experiences of that undifferentiated world that's kind of the same for everyone would be different. But the mind that thinks about them is really only looking at the film, because remember that all the light that's coming into it is light, is the truth. So the light is the truth, the film is what is not true, but all we're seeing is what we're recreating through this and through these minds here that see it in the world. We have to believe it's there, and emission is basically that concept of emitting into the world a vision that you see. Today, we use I think it's intromission, I think they call it, which is basically what we all know as the world being subjects and objects being in the world. And it's really interesting that subjects and objects are such a big part of the English language, as opposed to some languages where it's not as distinct, like this is speaking to this and everything else. It's interesting that English is so subject-object oriented. And me being an English teacher at one time could really kind of see that. That's how that would make you kind of, and I think there's a lot of problems with a lot of, especially Eastern students when they come in to try to learn English, is to really get over that concept, because that's really attacking the core of many other languages where don't make that distinction as clear as we do, that's for sure. Okay, so maybe another way to think of this is going back to some other images that we've seen. Okay, so if our thoughts mean nothing, let's kind of explain that a little better. So we talked about the reptilian brain being like the autonomic brain, the limbic brain being the mammal brain. Keep in mind that this is more an accurate representation of what is in the universal mind. Is sort of these kind of, and there's a lot of really interesting research with this, and how young babies that are usually in their early years are kind of using the reptilian and the limbic brain a lot more, kind of see themselves as less differentiated until the outer cerebral brain is kind of developed, which is very interesting. Keep in mind, these are all subconscious. So the term that a lot of philosophers use is a priori. So the idea of a priori, the idea that there's something before what we learn as we're human beings. So this is kind of more of a representation of what we learn since we're born, is what's in here and what's what's our individual experience of the world. A priori is kind of an idea that there's something else in the mind that represents something that is kind of brought into the world. So you could just call it like animal-like instinct if you want, and I'd say that's more like the limbic brain. So our instincts of what helped us survive in our past. And then there's maybe even something a little more deep. So a universal truth that we're all kind of aspiring to. And that's something that Plato talked about a lot. Plato talked about the world of the perfect forms, of the world of that we cannot see, that we used to be part of. And Empedocles spoke of that as well. So there's something that we came from that we remember as a priori, something that we remember from another time and another place that is representing itself into the world. An example of this is the propensity of analogies. So things being like something else, if you really try to. I've given you many analogies that we've already talked about and what we've talked about, and also, and I would say a lot of them are very accurate to understanding a universal truth. And then also threes. I really noticed this when I was doing educational work, is that things often appear in sort of, we'll call it like a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And this kind of makes a triangle. There is, that's a really bad triangle. There is a lot of things that take these 3 points, and there's kind of this synthesis between the two opposites. And this is something that we see in so much stuff. If you really look for it, it's everywhere. It's really amazing how it just seems like it's everywhere. So think of our mind, and what we're going to be telling ourselves as far as our thoughts not meaning anything is basically what most of our conscious thoughts are, representation of this outer matter, which is kind of useless for understanding a priori, although not completely useless. And that's why dream introspection is really important, and some of the images that we see can be very accurate depictions of reality. So again, in my general propensity to beat a dead horse, let's show it as the other images we talked about too. So we want to highlight that this very little top here, which would be your conscious thoughts, really has no idea what's going on. And when you ask your conscious thoughts, what am I seeing? It's going to always tell you something, but it's never going to be right. And that's what the Course says many times as well. So you can think of yourselves as that little, this is more like your ego consciousness. And your ego consciousness on this big, powerful animal would be somewhat similar as well. Although I would say that right now this analogy doesn't work near as well as this one and the other one. The one that I used at the very beginning. Okay, so today we're going to do it a little differently. We're not going to start with the idea for the day. We're going to start, as it says here, our step number 1, begin with noting the thoughts that are crossing your mind for about a minute. So you can close your eyes, or you can just sit there without your eyes closed and just watch the thoughts. We've all had an experience of this if we've done meditation. And it's pretty easy, right? You just kind of sit there and just notice what the trend of it is, and notice what the ideas that come across. And only about a minute, because you don't want to forget what you're kind of grasping onto as far as the concepts. And then you just say as a general statement, these thoughts about whatever the main concept was, which would be in this little central area here. 1 second. So whatever the most important thought would be right here, do not mean anything. They are like the things I see in this room, on the street, from this window, and in this place. So reaffirming that cerebral part of our brain really only knows what it's seen in the world. And what we're saying is what we've seen in the world is not representing at all what is in the real actual world. So we need to decode, unwire this thinking that we've done for so long. So A couple of ideas that really are really important to understand of what I've took from the actual writing is the good thoughts are but shadows of what lies beyond. So that undifferentiated world we talked about. And the shadows make sight difficult. So that film is what is impeding our natural sort of light consciousness. The bad ones are blocks to sight, so are complete blocks and make seeing impossible. You do not want either. It is the first attempt in a long range purpose of learning to see the meaningless as outside of you and the meaningful within. So the truth is that reflection that takes the initial, and that's not even actually you, but that first mirror that takes the reflection as more accurately depicting you. It is also the beginning of training your mind to recognize what is the same and what is different. Do not repeat these exercises more than 3 or 4 times during the day. So basically just take every 4 or 5 hours, take a few minutes out and do this and just watch your thoughts for a moment and just reinforce that these thoughts about this subject do not mean anything. Okay, so good luck to you today. Hope it goes well, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.